back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. Hassan El-Tayyab is legislative director, is the legislative director, for Middle East policy and is an advocacy organizer for the Friends Committee on National Legislation. That is the Quaker organization, the Friends Committee on National Legislation. He's an author. He's a songwriter. He is also a long-standing worker in the areas of international policy, advocacy. Before joining the Quaker group, he was co-director of Just Foreign Policy, which has been on this program, where he worked to reassert congressional authority over war powers and to promote human rights in the Middle East and Latin America. And he joins us now to discuss the unfolding situation in the Middle East. So first of all, Hassan, thank you for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. And obviously, this is a tragic time all around. We've certainly talked about the ongoing loss of life on both sides. And one of the things I wanted to, we can cover any aspect of this you like, but one aspects of it that's been troubling me the most, I think, is the bellicose nature of the rhetoric out of Washington, D.C. I think most of us, all of us, are horrified by the violence we've seen on television and the killing of innocents. But of course, the killing of innocents is not a new occurrence in Palestine as well. But it has struck me, and correct me if you disagree, I would be delighted to find I'm wrong. It has struck me that if one hopes to, as I do and as I imagine you do, to advocate for more rational and humane policy in the Israel-Palestine situation, it strikes me that the last few days have been disappointing and even personally shocking to hear the extent of the rhetoric and the insistence on avoiding any semblance of context or balance. Am I overreacting, you think?
Well, Richard, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate you giving me a platform to talk about this. I am Arab American. I've got family in Jordan. I've got family. My aunt is from Jenin. I've got friends in Israel. I've got friends in Gaza and the West Bank. And so this is just deeply heartbreaking and personal. And you never want to see attacks and violence against civilians, full stop. But if you don't have that context, if you don't also talk about the fact that there was a 16-year blockade in Gaza, that there's systemic oppression, including a military occupation, rampant and escalating settler violence happening in the West Bank, a lack of basic dignity for the Palestinian people, you're not getting the full picture. And you might really be rushing to, accept policy solutions that really just keep the cycles of violence going. And that's what we're seeing on the airwaves. I mean, you see Israeli officials talking about quote unquote human animals. That is really scary rhetoric that, to us, it signals that we're going to see really just mass atrocities, potential genocide of Palestinian civilians. And that is really just all of our red flags are getting waved right now, and we have to be very careful how we think about this, how we message about it. U.S. lawmakers are stepping in line to echo a lot of this and say Lindsey Graham was on TV calling this a religious war, and Israel, go for it, do what you need to do. And what FCNL thinks, and we just sent a 26 national faith org letter to Capitol Hill signed by organizations like the Methodists, the Mennonites, the Presbyterians, the Quakers, and a whole bunch of other faith groups, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, and saying very clearly that we need a ceasefire now, not tomorrow, not next week, not in a couple weeks from now. We need a ceasefire, de-escalation, restraint, respect for humanitarian law. We need to protect civilians. We need to get those hostages home, but we also need to make sure that bombs don't keep falling on children in Gaza. 1 million children in Gaza exist right now under the age of 18, weren't around when Hamas took over the Gaza Strip. And people forget that. They say, well, you shouldn't have elected Hamas. I'm like, these are children we're talking about. We're also prioritizing humanitarian aid, a humanitarian corridor, and really, bottom line, addressing root causes. Those root causes are the blockade, systemic oppression, racism, settler violence, home demolition, child detention, annexation, and the list goes on. Excuse me. But yeah, I completely agree. Very horrified, very shocked. I do think that in the coming days, as more and more media comes out about what's happening and the atrocities against civilians, that there's going to be more space for members to speak out in favor of a ceasefire and de-escalation. Right now, the emotion is very high, but that's why we got to keep the drumbeat going for ceasefire. And that's what the Palestinians in Gaza that we're talking to are asking for.
And, it's worth noting, as I know you know well, Hassan, that not only are half the residents of Gaza under the age of 18, but there hasn't been an election in Gaza in their lifetimes, much less somebody they can vote for. And in addition, it's a war crime, collective punishment of a population, even if there had been an election, collective punishment of a civilian population for their government's action is a war crime, which, I don't mean to be inflammatory, especially with someone that, like you, that works with lawmakers, but it seems to me that while clearly what Hamas did was brutal and also a war crime, that to send armaments as the United States is doing to Israel, which has announced that it's going to level Gaza, that it will be a city in ruins, said Netanyahu, and so on, that you mentioned the reference to human animals, the shutoff of electricity, which is, as we speak, undoubtedly taking lives and so on, causing deaths. The deaths of children we've seen already. I think the Gaza Health Ministry says nearly 228 West Bank Palestinians, I believe, have been murdered to date by settlers and retaliatory violence. That it raises a question in my mind whether the United States is not only falling in line rhetorically, but guilty of abetting a war crime.
Well, right now, we do not keep track of how U.S. weapons are being used by Israel. Full stop. We know that weapons are being transferred to settlers in the West Bank. We know that, warplanes, missiles, joint direct attack munitions, all of these, all this material is being used. Now, I completely agree. And we have to do a better job here in the U.S. to hold our lawmakers accountable and make sure that they don't endorse, this kind of policy. There are vehicles out there that we've been hammering on for years, like the Betty McCollum bill, and that does put some end-use restrictions, at least on funding. FCNL, we don't support weapons of war to Saudi, to the UAE, to Israel, to Egypt. We are just not about weapons. We are about peace, diplomacy, resolving the root causes of the problem. And, okay, Israel goes in there, bombs Gaza back to the Stone Age. That's what they want to do. That's what they're planning on doing. What happens after that? Is that going to de-escalate the situation on the ground? Is that going to make Israel safer in the medium to long term or even the short term? No. If anything, it showed that, that Gaza, this situation can't be contained behind a barbed wire fence, that things are going to keep escalating and keep exploding. until you address root causes. Now, many people have different ideas about what that is. To us, it's pretty clear. It's a disrespect for human rights, and that's what we need: human rights, equality. This leveling of Gaza, it's just absolutely atrocious. They are war crimes. We can condemn violence against civilians, and we have vociferously condemned the Hamas attacks, but we also condemn indiscriminate airstrikes, collective punishment. And that's why, I wanted to jump on this show. We've never chatted before, but I'm really appreciative of you giving, folks a platform to talk about the simple need for de-escalation. And I just give folks maybe something to chew on, that we don't necessarily have to agree on everything right now. That's not what we need to do. We don't need to hash out all of the root causes. We don't need to agree on, what to do about the blockade. You already know where I stand. But all we need to do is agree on a ceasefire. That's what we need urgently, because every single day this goes on, for whatever reason. You could want a ceasefire to bring the hostages home from Israel, to Israel. You could want a ceasefire to protect civilians in Gaza. You could want a ceasefire to prevent this from escalating into a wider regional conflict that includes Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Iran, etc. But let's just agree on a ceasefire before this gets out of hand even further. And we could, hopefully we agree on why, but that's what we're echoing. It doesn't matter. Let's just get to the ceasefire. Let's stop the dropping of all these bombs and get back on the road to addressing the fundamental causes of this escalation.
I really appreciate, Hassan, the clarity of that position, because I feel as if I'm surrounded in every aspect of my life and every aspect of my family and their work lives and what they bring home about conversations there, arguments there, and so on. I feel as if I'm surrounded by broader debates. But I think the clarity of a ceasefire call is very important and very immediate, because there is, as you just said, I can't imagine a view of the ideal outcome for the Middle East that is not served by an immediate ceasefire. First of all, we all say we deplore, and I have no reason to doubt anybody in this conversation, this global conversation, we deplore the loss of innocent life. That's the only way to stop the loss of innocent life, number one. Number two, if you believe, I grew up raised in Judaism. My religious education began at age 5 or 6. Israel was very much a part of that upbringing. It was relatively new when I was growing up. If you believe in the survival and the safety and the preservation of Israel, you should want a ceasefire, because an acceleration of the violence will not serve Israel. And of course, if you believe in a one-state solution, two-state solution, again, it will serve it. So much so that I wonder why it's such an unpopular position. We have the White House telling us that it is repugnant and disgraceful for Democratic lawmakers, of whom there are quite sadly only a few, calling for a ceasefire. How could this be when it appears to be in everybody's interest, including, by the way, the tactical strategic interest of the United States itself, which does not want to see even more entrenched hostility towards this country in the Middle East? Why would that be considered repugnant by the leadership of this country, you think?
Yeah. I can't speak for the decision-making process in the White House and I think they're going to come around. They have to come around. I keep telling people there will be a ceasefire. The question is, how close to today can we make that, right? Will this drag on for weeks, months, turn into this larger thing and turn, the whole region into rubble? Or can we prevent a worst case scenario by getting people to actually agree to stop the violence right now? And that to me is, I'm 100% clear and focused on that. We need as many individuals, organizations, and members of Congress in that, in that order. You as an individual can call your friends, can call the organization, call your, church, synagogue, your mosque, your Baha'i temple, whatever. Let's get everybody on board with an immediate ceasefire to prevent a worst case scenario, which isn't good for Israel. It's not good for Gaza. It's not good for the West Bank. It's not good for anybody. So that's where we're at. I expect that you're going to see a drumbeat happening on the Hill. We sent this national faith letter to every office and the White House this morning. We got some good replies. Not the statements exactly. People aren't rushing to make those statements just yet. The politics are pretty hard right now. And, there are just a ton of emotions behind this, that this particular issue, Israel and Palestine, it is the thorniest issue in the world. And, if all of the other issues just kind of like seem to somehow connect back to this one. And I don't know exactly why that is or how that happened, but that just seems to be the case. So yeah, there are a lot of emotions. And what I'm trying to do is just cut through that noise and just say, you know what, let's just stop the violence and the killing. We don't want to see any Israeli hostages executed. We want to see them return home with their families. Again, for me, this is personal. I got family and friends over there. I want to see everyone safe. I don't care if they're Jewish, I don't care if they're Muslim, Christian, any religion, any faith, any perspectives that they have. Let's just get people home. Let's get people safe. And I think the administration is good. If we keep that drumbeat going, they're eventually going to have to change their position. And we're trying to accelerate the day when Biden picks up the phone and calls Bibi Netanyahu and says, you got to end this. Last cycle, the major cycle we had in 2021 in May, when Sheikh Jarrah was kind of popping off and the Israelis were doing all these airstrikes on Gaza, it took 11 days. And we had, over 100 members of Congress calling for a ceasefire at that point. And that really kind of, really put pressure on the administration. We had 130 or so members on the House side and about 30 on the Senate side, led by Senator Ossoff. That was really important and powerful. That's where we need to get to. And also flag that AOC and Bernie, they led a joint resolution of disapproval to actually block new weapon sales to Saudi Arabia that FCNL and 150 national orgs supported. And that was a real tipping point where Biden said, you know what, I'm getting hammered here at home. Bibi, we got to end this. We're in a different situation right now. The Hamas attacks, that changes the dynamics for sure, but we got to get there.
Now, I think you said you've been in touch with, in addition to sending out this letter from the faith groups, I think have you been directly in touch with some of the congressional and senatorial offices in the last day or two? I know this has been unfolding incredibly rapidly. And if so, have you gotten any read? I mean, are there people who are in sympathy, but they're keeping their head down because they're seeing the condemnations? They don't want to take the heat quite yet, or, this is something that's invisible, I think, to most of us. And those of us who care passionately about this issue, and, I have relatives there. Some of my dearest friends are Palestinians. So, like you, I care. I love people, really. Care about people on both sides. I guess what I'm trying to get my head a sense of, if you're able to provide it, is whether what we're seeing is just a lockstep from, national politicians in this country, or a sense that right now, while emotions are so inflamed, they just rather let it die down a little bit before stepping out, or is it too early to even tell? Do you have any sense of that?
Well, I want to flag some of the good things that have happened.
Okay.
Barbara Lee has called for a ceasefire. That's really important. She's a prominent member of Congress. Other Democrats very much respect her. She is progressive, but, she is regarded in the Democratic caucus. Senator Markey was at a rally in Massachusetts and actually said, hey, we need a ceasefire. Senator Sanders has called for respect for international law and restraint. Hasn't quite said, as I'm calling it, the C word, but getting close there. I just had a meeting, with a bunch of Senate offices in the past couple days. What I'm hearing is a lot of folks are, this is the thorniest issue that they have to probably work on in their portfolios, and emotions are so high. People are, really grieving and upset and emotional, and they're kind of in a wait and see mode. For me, what I tell them, this is how I respond to the wait and see approach. We don't want to wait and see this turn into a regional conflict that involves Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Iran, and militants, and we just do not want to see that. So the real value add right now is do the ceasefire now, so it doesn't turn into an absolute mess in the coming weeks. But as reports of civilian casualties come in, they're going to have a harder and harder time ignoring that. So I would say on Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday of next week, I think people are going to be in a different place than they are right now. And so that's why it's so important to keep the drumbeat going, keep calling for the ceasefire, being very clear with our demand. And I think it's going to move the hill.
That's very interesting. Thank you for that. And, I've focused my questions up to now on, in terms of the politics of this in the United States. And obviously, what must remain in the forefront for all of us in our consciousness is the human tragedy in the Middle East, not what's going on here in the United States. But our field of action for most of us as Americans is here. So that's the reason I'm not in any way, hopefully misplacing the human priorities here. But with that in mind, most of my questions to now have focused on Democrats and whether, lobbying of Democrats or persuading of Democrats, the persuadability of Democrats. But on the other side of the aisle, which is clearly, I know a lot of people who cover the Hill as journalists, and everything is consumed on the Republican side in the House with the speakership fight. But one of the things, I won't say it's surprising, but perhaps inconsistent, is that while there's a group of Republicans that are reluctant to continue our military support for Ukraine, they appear to have been almost uniformly urging support for military as opposed to ceasefire action in Palestine by Israel. And I'm wondering whether, A, you think that perception is correct, and B, if there's anything to work with on the Republican side as well in terms of lobbying for ceasefire.
Yeah, we got to keep going. We have to bring this message to everybody. Sometimes I send these letters and I just send them to Democrats, depending on the letter. This one today, I needed to send that to everybody. This is a moral call. This is a humanitarian call. This is a call that will protect Americans. It's going to protect Israelis. It's going to protect Palestinians. We need a ceasefire. I will say, just to give a little bit more nuance on this conversation, that's a tough caucus right now for a variety of reasons. The most space I've seen is with the Rand Pauls of the world kind of saying, well, I don't think Iran was really involved. That's actually helpful for the larger conversation to kind of like decouple this from some of the tensions around U.S.-Iran relations. So that's something to work on, and keep reinforcing and really stressing that. There doesn't seem to be evidence of direct coordination for this attack. There certainly is, military assistance, training that's happened in the past, and financing. But as far as direct coordination, it does seem, the evidence is pretty clear that this seems like, has originated inside Gaza and isn't this wider thing. Although we don't want it to turn into a wider conflict, I think that's, could be helpful with some Republicans at this point. But again, prioritizing bringing Americans home, de-escalation to bring Americans home. It might be one of the better messages for the Republican caucus right now. They've got a whole mess over there in the House. They don't even have a speaker at this point. We're seeing that unfold. That puts into question how they would actually get more funding through the House. There's talks about tying it to Ukraine aid. And that seems to be a non-starter for a lot of Republicans right now to do that, which, I think it may be helpful in some ways. So we'll see how that unfolds and what happens with the House speakership. There's clearly a lot of support among Senate Republicans, the broad majority of Senate Republicans to really increase this aid. But with that said, I'll just say it one more time, is that, okay, aid to Israel, you want to do that, let's do a ceasefire. They're not mutually exclusive. We can do both. Like if that's how you want to approach this. Again, FCNL, we don't support military aid or weapons to any country because we're, the Quaker Peace Lobby and we're, pacifist by nature. But ceasefire should come first. It doesn't matter how you feel about any of these other issues. You can support a ceasefire.
Now, I'm glad you mentioned Iran because, I would say the signature foreign policy achievement of the Obama administration was the agreement with Iran. And yet, we've seen that unwound by certainly by Trump, and then perhaps not fully reinvigorated by Biden. It's certainly not, where it was when it was first enacted, based on my understanding. And we have seen, as you mentioned, as you say, Hamas has received aid and assistance from Iran, but we have seen reports, unconfirmed, using anonymous sources, saying this whole thing was planned by Hamas, and there have been suggestions that Russia might have been involved in some way too. Criticism. Russia has expressed concern, I'm told, but not direct criticism. So one of the concerns about, is the virality of, if you will, of hostilities here, that messages are coming out that might be used to attack diplomatic movement toward diplomacy in other situations as well, whether it's Iran or trying to resolve the situation in Russia and Ukraine. Are you seeing any of that in these moving pieces? Is there any concern that this will be used to leverage more hostility towards Iran or do even more to block negotiation in Ukraine or what have you? Do you see any connectivity there?
Unfortunately, I do. It's a really sad moment for a lot of our progressive foreign policy. Just as the war in Ukraine has been really horrible for progressive foreign policy and what that's meant for, getting attention on issues like ending the war in Yemen and, trying to, bring humanitarian assistance and for people in Afghanistan, Ethiopia, in Tigray and Sudan and Libya, it's like I could go on how much this is distracted. And also, I have a lot of criticisms here for the Biden administration, but one thing I'm actually really excited about was the prisoner exchange that just happened in August. We brought 5 Iranian Americans home and got them back with their families in exchange for unfreezing, releasing some Iranian prisoners, but also unfreezing $6 billion in assets for Iran to purchase humanitarian assistance. And some people are falsely trying to say that $6 billion was used to fund weapons to Hamas, and when that's just absolutely absurd. It was clear that this was only to be used through a financial channel, through a Swiss transaction, to get humanitarian purchases like medicine and medical equipment and food assistance and things of that nature. So the idea that somehow unfreezing assets or, de-escalating tensions between the US and Iran gave Hamas an opening, just really, there's not much there. But the problem is people can just repeat lies and just continue to push out this narrative that any sort of dialogue, negotiation, de-escalation is a sign of weakness, which I reject. It's actually a complete sign of strength to actually talk to someone you don't agree with and try to work out what's in your mutual best interest and try to prevent further conflict. And it just goes to show you, how much the war machine has really captured Washington, D.C., the military-industrial complex, Pentagon contractors, weapons, weapons being sold, foreign governments lobbying the U.S. And, even with, you look at Senator Menendez and what he's going through right now with, taking gold bars in exchange for military aid to Egypt, despite their human rights violations. Absolutely atrocious behavior by members of Congress and all the people that supported this, all the staffers, all the NGOs, all like the other, lobbyists and supporting this kind of status quo. What does that say about the state of Washington, D.C. right now? Really glad to see him no longer, chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, given all that's going on. But, truly a sad moment. But again, trying to put all that aside, prioritizing the ceasefire, de-escalation, and then let's work together to pick up the pieces.
All right. Well, what's next for the struggle for the ceasefire? Just keep working it like you're working it.
We've done a couple things. We've got that big faith letter. I'm working on a wider NGO letter right now with some colleagues, and we're hoping to, get a broader call. We're going to even make it more simple and tailor it just about the ceasefire and some humanitarian issues, and see how many people we can get on that ask. But we're also working on getting individuals to lobby their members of Congress. We've got this Quaker network in all 50 states. We've got an action that we just sent to our entire email list. We've got 17,000 emails to Congress and counting. Go to fcnl.org. You can find it right there. It's the first thing you'll see. Again, fcnl.org. Send a message, and if you don't like our messaging, you want to be softer, or you want to be harsher, you want to do whatever, JVP, J Street, there's a lot of differences between folks, but look for people that are putting out the simple call for a ceasefire and that you agree with, the way they're framing it, totally endorse all the different approaches, as long as the bottom line is ceasefire in Gaza.
So I go to fcnl.org, I see de-escalate the violence and a box that says act now, and I click that, and that's how I do that, right?
That's simple.
All right. Well, look, Hassan El-Tayyab, you have a tough job, and I thank you for all your great work in this area. Please keep us posted on how the work toward a ceasefire is going, and thank you for coming on the program.
Richard, thank you so much. I want to hear more about your music at a later date, because when we're not trying to end these wars, we're got to keep the music going. But thank you again.
And again, thank you. And we'll be right back. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.